This is a homily for the fourth Sunday of Lent. The Gospel for this Sunday comes from the Gospel of St. Luke, chapter 15, verses 1 to 3 and verses 11 to 32. To download the text of this homily as a PDF file, go to sundayhomilies.au. Let us survey our Lenten journey so far. On the first Sunday of Lent, Jesus entered the desert, and there he was tested by the devil. On the second Sunday of Lent, Jesus ascended a mountain, together with Peter, James, and John, and there he was transfigured. On the third Sunday of Lent, Jesus told the parable of the barren fig tree. And today we have another parable, a parable that is unique to Luke's Gospel, the parable of the Prodigal Son. Today's Gospel is taken from the longest section of Luke's Gospel. Jesus and his disciples are slowly making their way to Jerusalem for the celebration of Passover. Chapter 15 of Luke's Gospel begins with three parables about something or someone being lost. Firstly, the lost sheep. What man among you with 100 sheep, losing one, would not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the missing one till he found it? Secondly, the lost coin. What woman with 10 drachmas would not, if she lost one, light a lamp and sweep out the house and search thoroughly till she found it? And thirdly, the parable of the father and his lost son, or perhaps his lost sons. On the fourth Sunday of Lent, the lectionary passes over the first two parables and gives us the third parable. In Year C, on the 24th Sunday of Ordinary Time, the lectionary includes all three parables with the option of reading the first two and omitting the third parable. This year, however, the Feast of the Exaltation of the Holy Cross falls on the 24th Sunday of Ordinary Time and takes precedence. Let's pause here briefly to see what parables are all about. Our English word parable comes from the Greek parabole. The Greek word parabole is made up of para, which means next to or alongside. We speak, for example, of parallel lines. The second part of the word, bole, comes from the Greek verb balein, which means to throw. So, etymologically, the word parable means to throw next to or to throw alongside. What does that mean? Well, a parable seeks to explain something that we know little or nothing about. Today's parable is about God's mercy. So let's throw up alongside the unknown something that we are familiar with, and we go from the known to the unknown. The known in today's Gospel are three stories about something or someone being lost. We need to keep in mind, however, that whenever we say that A is like B, the analogy is never perfect. So, for example, the Scottish poet Robert Burns once wrote, "O my love's like a red, red rose that's newly sprung in June." What did he mean by that? That love is better by the dozen? That love is fresher if kept in water? That love is prickly with thorns? Or that love will fade as quickly as the flower wilts in the summer heat? A parable will evoke numerous interpretations. It is our job to sort through them. We can be fairly sure that in this case the poet did not intend any of these interpretations. New Testament scholar Daniel Harrington tells us that a parable is a form of analogy that seeks to illuminate one reality by appealing to something better known. Another New Testament scholar, C.H. Dodd, tells us that at its simplest, a parable is a metaphor or simile drawn from nature or common life, arresting the hearer by its vividness or strangeness, and leaving the mind in sufficient doubt about its precise application to tease it into active thought. There are 4 important elements in Dodd's description of a parable. Firstly, it is a metaphor or simile. We must therefore keep in mind that, like Robert Burns's Red, Red Rose, a parable will evoke numerous interpretations, and it is our job to sort through them. Secondly, a parable draws analogies from nature or common life. Thirdly, it arrests the hearer by its vividness or strangeness. And finally, it leaves the mind in sufficient doubt about its precise application to tease it into active thought. Dodd then goes on to tell us that the parable has the character of an argument, in that it entices the hearer to a judgment upon the situation depicted. It then challenges the hearer, directly or by implication, to apply that judgment to the matter in hand. So, in the case of today's parable, what judgment do we make about the father and his 2 sons? And secondly, and more importantly, how does the judgment that I've just made about the father and his 2 sons apply to me? Jewish New Testament scholar Amy Jill Levine makes an interesting observation. Religion has been defined as designed to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. We do well to think of the parables of Jesus as doing the afflicting. Therefore, if we hear a parable and think, I really like that, or worse, fail to take any challenge, we are not listening well enough. Although we'll only be considering the third of these 3 parables, we need to begin by asking about the context. What has prompted Jesus to tell these 3 parables? Keep in mind that there is no text without context. Or, to express this idea in different words, a text without a context is just a pretext for making it say anything one wants. So here's the context. The tax collectors and the sinners were all seeking the company of Jesus to hear what he had to say, and the Pharisees and the scribes complained. This man welcomes sinners and eats with them. Let's pause here to ask, who are the Pharisees and the scribes? Firstly, let's consider the Pharisees. Our English word Pharisee comes to us from the Hebrew word perushim, which means the separate ones, or the separatists. Jewish scholar Rabbi Shea Cohen says that it's unclear what precisely the Pharisees separated themselves from. Was it from Gentiles? Was it from sources of ritual impurity? Or was it from irreligious Jews? Quite possibly it was from all 3 of these. Rabbi Cohen tells us that it is likely that the term was first used by the group's opponents in order to denigrate it. Separatists, they cried, and that it never became part of the group's self-definition. At least, it never so appears in the Mishnah or in the bulk of rabbinic tradition. What we know of the Pharisees comes from three major sources. Firstly, the New Testament. Pharisees are mentioned 99 times in the New Testament. Secondly, we have the writings of the Jewish historian Josephus, who lived between 37 AD and about 101 AD. So Josephus is writing at the same time that the New Testament was being written. In his many volumes, Josephus mentions the Pharisees fewer than 20 times. Finally, we have rabbinic writings, especially the Mishnah and the Talmuds. Although the Mishnah was compiled sometime around 200 AD, and the Talmuds date between the 5th and 6th centuries AD, they include earlier material. As far as we can tell, the Pharisees numbered 6,000 at the time of King Herod, who died in 4 BC. Josephus explicitly states that the Pharisees had the support of the masses and carry great weight in public religious matters. The Sadducees are supported by the aristocracy alone. Josephus tells us this: the Pharisees handed down to the people certain regulations from the ancestral succession, and not recorded in the laws of Moses, for which reason they are rejected by the Sadducean group, who hold that only those regulations should be considered valid which were written in the Torah, and that those which had been handed down by the fathers need not be observed. And concerning these matters, the two parties came to have controversies and serious differences. One of the difficulties scholars have when it comes to the Pharisees is that they didn't leave behind any writings about themselves, about their beliefs, or about their way of life. There is, however, one notable exception. St. Paul, in his letter to the Philippians, which was written sometime between 50 and 60 AD, tells us that he was a Pharisee. And in his letter to the Galatians, he boasts of his zeal for the ancestral traditions. He writes, "In Judaism, I outstripped many contemporaries among my people by being much more zealous for the traditions of my ancestors." Here he is boasting of his former piety as a Pharisee. Notice that Josephus and Paul both emphasize ancestral traditions. Josephus speaks of certain regulations from the ancestral succession and not recorded in the laws of Moses. Paul speaks of his zeal for the traditions of my ancestors. It would seem then that a key aspect of Pharisaical piety was a loyalty to ancestral customs and traditions. Alongside the Pharisees, Luke mentions the scribes, sopharim in the Hebrew and grammatius in the Greek. Who are they? New Testament scholar Joel Marcus tells us this about the role of a scribe. The term is used in a variety of related senses in Greek, corresponding in some ways to the range in meaning of the English word secretary, which can denote everything from a typist to a high government official. In Greek, analogously, a scribe may be a copyist, a government official in charge of records, an official with responsibility for enforcing the law, or a sage or teacher who interprets the law. In general, we could say that scribes are Torah scholars, learned guides of the community and guardians of the tradition. In the musical Fiddler on the Roof, Tevye the milkman is attempting to maintain his Jewish religious and cultural traditions as outside influences encroach upon the life of his family. He asks, "And how do we keep our balance?" I can tell you in one word: tradition. So let's now look at the third of these three parables. Let's begin by asking how we should name it. It's the parable of what? The most popular title must surely be the parable of the prodigal son. However, the term prodigal son is never used in the parable itself. That title goes back to St. Jerome, a biblical scholar who translated the scriptures into Latin. Commenting on this parable, he referred to the prudent and prodigal sons. Note, the word prodigal means wastefully extravagant. The younger son is certainly wastefully extravagant, but his prodigality is not the main point of the story. If anyone is prodigal in the story, it must surely be the father. He hands over to his younger son the inheritance that he demands. But more importantly, the father is prodigal with his love and forgiveness. Perhaps a better title would be The Father and His Two Lost Sons. The younger son loses his way and ends up squandering his entire inheritance. But as we'll see in a moment, the elder son is lost in a more subtle way. Some refer to this as the parable of the running father. It's a suggestion made, among others, by New Testament scholar Tom Wright. He explains, "In a culture where senior figures are far too dignified to run anywhere, this man takes to his heels as soon as he sees his young son dragging himself home." New Testament scholar Brendan Byrne would agree. We modern readers have to understand that this is totally unconventional behaviour for a dignified man of affairs in the Palestinian cultural world. To leave the house to meet one of lower rank, to run rather than walk sedately, to display emotion extravagantly in public, all this involves serious loss of face and dignity. Finally, some have cynically named this the parable of the absent mother, arguing that none of this would have happened in the first place if the mother had been on the scene. Keep in mind that this story is set within a culture where shame and honour are paramount. The action of the younger brother brought shame on his father and his family. Firstly, the father's land would have to be divided, with the younger boy selling off his share of the estate to someone else. Family property forcibly sold off to others. Secondly, asking for his share before his father's death bears a certain callousness. And thirdly, by heading off to a distant land, he was abandoning his obligation to care for his father in his old age. The Gospel tells us that the younger brother squandered all of his money on a life of debauchery. He ends up penniless. The country in which he's living experiences a severe famine. The only job he could find was looking after pigs. For a Jew, the pig is an unclean animal. The Mishnah, although coming from a later period, almost certainly reflects Jewish culture at the time of Jesus. It states, "No Israelite may raise swine anywhere." So here he is, in a foreign land, tending unclean animals. From a Jewish point of view, this is utter degradation. He had hit rock bottom. Some time ago, the London Telegraph carried an article entitled "Three Little Pigs Create a Big Huff." Israel's largest importer of quality wooden toys was selling toy farms, but they were faced with a dilemma. Should they remove the little carved pigs? While more liberal Jews might not be worried, the idea of having pigs in a toy farm was abhorrent to Orthodox Jews. Let me quote from the article. One parent complained, "How can you let children play with those pigs? It is a bad influence, and it is just not right. To many people in Israel, it is not right to play with unholy animals. The image of the pig is a very powerful one in Jewish history, and it is an offensive image." Well, that's a view expressed in the 21st century. Imagine how abhorrent it would have been 2,000 years ago. In today's parable, we're not just talking about playing with toy pigs, we're talking about working with real pigs and being prepared to eat their leftovers. In symbolic terms, the younger son had hit rock bottom. The son then comes to his senses and decides to return home. The Greek text reads, eis eoton de elthon, which translates literally as, to himself, however, having come. In other words, he returns to the person he is. The Hebrew verb to return is shub. The Hebrew verb shub means to return or go back. The basic meaning is movement back to the point of departure. This verb is used over 1,000 times in the Old Testament. It is used extensively in the Old Testament to describe a physical returning, such as a returning to a place or a person. The term is also used in the context of restoration, indicating a return to a previous state or condition. But shub doesn't always refer to a physical return. It is also used to describe a metaphorical return, such as a turning back to God or repenting from sin. The younger son has made up his mind to return home, but has he truly repented? He rehearses in his own mind what he's going to say to his father. "How many of my father's hired men have all the food they want and more, and here am I, dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father and say, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired men.'" Is he repenting or conniving? He's quite aware that his father is still a wealthy man and that he might be able to squeeze something more from him. He has come to himself, but that self is one who knows that his father will do anything he asks. He's the classic manipulator. Notice that his initial address begins with the word father, not sir or lord or master. He's certainly pulling on his father's heartstrings when he says he no longer deserves to be called son. Whether or not the son is sincere, his father doesn't care. The father gives orders for the fatted calf to be slaughtered. In a culture in which meat was seldom eaten, the slaughtering of a fattened animal for a celebration is a mark of great esteem. Now, the parable could have ended right at this point if it were a parable about forgiveness and repentance, if indeed the young son has truly repented. But we need to keep in mind the context of this parable. It is a response to the accusation by the Pharisees and scribes, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." So whom can we identify with the Pharisees in this story? It is, of course, the older brother. It's easy to sympathize with the older brother. He's been obedient, loyal, faithful, and constantly by his father's side. He's worked hard and was there when needed, but feels that he's been taken for granted. He's never been rewarded for all that he has done. As he approaches the house, he hears that a party is in full swing. When he finds out what's going on, we're told that he was angry and refused to go in. And so the father came out to invite him in. We're not told whether the older brother decides to join the festivities or whether he remains outside in protest. New Testament scholar Brendan Byrne offers this reflection. The story invites the audience to feel the older brother's anger and maybe recognize in themselves several aspects of his resistance. The contract mentality, the concern over property squandered, the resentment that others are getting favoured treatment instead of what they deserve. Dante's great epic, the Divine Comedy, is the story of a journey to paradise, to heaven. But Dante the pilgrim can only enter paradise after he has journeyed down to hell, and then slowly upwards from there through purgatory. We meet sinners in both hell and purgatory, but there is one difference. The sinners in purgatory have repented of their sin, and they are being purified before they can enter heaven. There are 7 terraces in purgatory, and the sinners on each of the terraces receive a punishment that is appropriate to the sin they have committed. On the second terrace we meet the envious. Envy in the Divine Comedy is resenting others for what they have, and this is precisely where we can place the older brother. He resents the lavish welcome home his brother has received. The punishment of purgatory is aimed at purification, and it is different for each group of sinners. The punishment of the envious is to have their eyelids sewn shut with wire. In this condition they are huddled together against the side of the mountain out of fear of falling off the edge. In life, their envy had weakened the bonds of community. In purgatory, they are temporarily blinded and forced to take hold of their neighbours, depending on them for safety and help in not falling off the mountain ledge. A question that helps us understand the meaning of this parable is this: where is the Father in this story? At the 2 pivotal points in the story, he is outside. Firstly, when he sees his younger son a long way off, he doesn't remain inside, thinking to himself, "I'll wait until he comes inside, grovelling to be welcomed home. Then I'll read him the riot act, telling him what an ungrateful fool he's been." None of that. The father runs out to greet his son. Secondly, when the older brother refuses to come inside and join in the celebrations, the father comes outside once more to plead with his son. This is an important theme in Luke's Gospel. Jesus is the one who welcomes the outsider. The very last words that Jesus speaks to another human being before dying are the words he addresses to an outsider, the thief crucified alongside him. The thief appeals to Jesus. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus assures this outsider, this day you will be with me in paradise. Today's parable leaves the question, well, where are you in the end? Inside, joining in the celebrations, or stuck outside, hearing the music and dancing, but too angry to go in? The Pharisees, like the older brother, fuming with resentment, refused to go in and remain outside. Their sin is one that often plagues good people. It's the sin of the constricted heart, the ungenerous spirit. God invites us to rejoice wherever beauty, truth, goodness, and repentance reveal themselves, even in younger brothers who squander their inheritance. The parable is a sad commentary on those, like the Pharisees, who refuse out of envy and resentment to accept the good news extended to the outcast.